All right, this is recording number 2 for Chapter 1. So it's Chapter 1, Module 2, which is from pages 7 to 18 in the book. At the end of this mini lecture, you will definitely have to do the Module 2 review questions in your composition book, and those are located on page 18. So Module 2 is all about environmental indicators and sustainability. And I briefly mentioned sustainability in the first mini lecture. And so what I'd like to do is further explain what sustainability is. Um, and because I don't think that I did a really good job with the first time. But the textbook says that sustainability is a way to live. And it's a way to live on Earth in a way that allows us to use its resources without overusing them or over harvesting them. So if we have a tuna population in the Atlantic Ocean and we're allowed to harvest tuna from the ocean, we don't just go out into the ocean and take every single tuna out of the ocean. Sustainability would be an approach where we would leave some behind, and those individuals that we leave behind are in reproductive age, so you would have to know the natural biology and life history of the tuna species, and also, a good ratio of male to female tuna. So those are just two areas within that area of, as an example, that would lead us to believe that that was a more sustainable choice as a country. So it allows us to use these resources without depriving them. So you want these resources around for future generations so that they can also use those resources. And really the goal of this course is to just live a more sustainable life once you're done with it, with this course. Thinking twice before you purchase something, or reading up on the company that made the product, where they harvested the resources for that product. Did the company actually choose sustainable, um, did they actually have sustainable choices in that process? So that's really what the focus is. So, what things in the environment would indicate um, sustainability? So, what we actually look at the Earth as one that has resources, but it also has services. Okay, so again, this is environmental indicators. So things in the environment that indicate to us something might be going wrong. We're going to be going over what those are. And when we know what those are, in what way can we make it better? And that's sustainability, so that it's around for future generations. So the key environmental indicators and those trends of them over time, that's one of the objectives. And then being able to define really what sustainability is and how it can actually be measured. And we will be doing an activity in class where you guys are going to measure your impact on the earth using this program online. Okay, so when we think about the earth, here's our beautiful earth, right? We have things that live on land, we have things that live in the water, and in each of those environments, those are different ecosystems. There are services that uh, the earth provides that are on land, and there's services in water and even in freshwater bodies. So there's the Great Lakes there. So what type of services, does the earth provide? And these services, are we dependent on them? So when we look at the services, we're talking about really the processes that occur in nature that help to support life, to support clean water, um, trees that are growing, crops that are growing. All of those things are produced. we take that pretty much for granted. When an environment is degraded, though, we actually see the results of that stress. Um, and so let's say you've got a field and you're growing corn, soybeans, potatoes, and what else? Tomatoes. Okay. So you have one row of corn, or maybe 100 rows of corn, 100 rows of soy, 100 rows of potato, 100 rows of tomato. This is actually called um, row cropping, which is when you're like growing different species in different rows. Each species takes out from the soil different things regarding ratios of, potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, the three main parts of fertilizer. These species have different requirements. So we grow them and they grow great, okay? And then the next year we maybe rotate it. That's called rotational cropping. And what you'll do then is instead of putting the tomatoes in the same spot, you'll put them over by the corn, where the corn was in the soil. And then you might put the corn at the other end. And then you switch the potatoes and the soybeans. And so what you're doing then is you understand soil science, okay? You understand the life history of these species regarding their requirements. You're combining that knowledge to use the land in a sustainable way, okay? So this is an example of sustainability in farming and um, knowing the services that this soil provides for those plants. So it provides a growth medium, right, for the roots to grow. It provides habitat for the species. And so knowing the services that this provides, uh, you would maybe get a better harvest. Okay, so there's a lot of like thought that has to go into this. It's not just planting whatever, wherever. You have to know soil type and all that. Um, so let's say that we didn't do all that research. Okay, so we decided to just use the land without really looking into the bedrock soil that's there and the drainage that's there and all of that. And then what we notice is that we have a decrease in yield in our crops. So that is when we see what we call the symptoms of a degraded like a degraded ecosystem or even a degraded area to grow crops. So in order to understand these symptoms, we have to understand and focus on the effect that we have on the environment and that we could use to measure the health of the environment. So that's just one of the examples. So it's really like if you have a decrease in yield of harvest, then it's definitely an indicator or what we would also call a symptom. And it's describing that the current state of this system here is degraded. And what do we have to do to fix it? And so that's where environmental scientists come in, and there's so many different areas in environmental science um, that you can go into. Um, there's really, out of looking at the whole picture, the global scale, there are 5 environmental indicators that are listed in Table 2.2. That's on page 8. And then in Table 2.1, it actually goes over what those indicators are and then what chapter they are covered in this book. So it's kind of like a brief introduction of what the indicator is, what they use to measure that indicator, and then what chapter we find it in. So what are these indicators that I keep talking about? So working backwards here. One of the biggest things is biological diversity. The A there. And biological diversity is covered on page 9, so you have to read up on that. And it's basically the diversity of life in an environment, but there's different scales to measure it. One, you may have heard of genetic diversity from back in biology. Another one is species diversity, which is the number of different species in a given area or region. Um, and, you know, so that's the number of different species in a given area. You may have heard of extinction before. So extinction is when the species is completely gone from the earth. But there's some steps before that. There's like precursors before extinction. One is called endangered, critically endangered. That means that their numbers are very low. And so, what could we do to help those numbers? So there's all different kinds of programs in place, especially in zoos and aquaria around the world. There's like a international database for critically endangered species that they have on site. And so let's say there's um, cheetah populations were really, really low in the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003, but we have cheetahs in the zoos. So what they do then, if there is a cheetah that is ready to reproduce in reproductive age, they'll ship the sperm from a male, maybe from Spain, all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, and then artificially inseminate, and then she'll have babies. And so that genetic diversity is really important with that because the numbers are so low. It is important to understand, though, too, that extinction is a natural process. And you guys need to jot that down for sure. It's a natural process. Things go extinct all the time. Species go extinct all the time, but not at the rate it's going today. So there's like this natural background extinction rate, which is described on page 10, which is the average rate in which a species goes extinct over a long term. In general, it's usually pretty slow. About one species goes extinct every million years. Um, so, you know, the rate at which species are going extinct today is definitely faster than the natural background extinction rate. So make sure you have that down. What are the things that are causing that? And that question right there is really what environmental scientists look into. And then what can we do in a sustainable way to change it or reduce our impact? And then the final part of diversity or type of diversity is ecosystem diversity, which is one of my favorites, which is a measure of the diversity of like habitats that exist in a given area. Um, so if you have like a very high number of different ecosystems in an area and they're very productive, that generally indicates that the environment is healthy. And so, uh, like for example, Cuyahoga Valley National Park, if you've never been there, it's a beautiful place right here in Ohio. That has all different kinds of ecosystems within it. There's wetlands, there's river, there's lakes, there's ponds, there's forests, there's prairie. And they're very productive. One of the reasons why it's like that is because there's very little impact from humans because it's protected. Um, but it is a great example of how we can coexist with nature because it's so urbanized around that national park. It actually is the only national park in our country that has impact from humans all around it. So it's a perfect study site for like a master's thesis or a doctoral in like research because it provides all of those impacts, yet it also provides the natural ecosystem that's there, which is really cool to see like the impact of different things. Um, the other component is food production, which is covered on page 11. It's our ability to grow food to nourish humans. And so you can read into that. The other thing is pretty much global climate change. Let's see here. I abbreviate it GCC, Global Climate Change. And it's important to know that it's basically an enhanced greenhouse effect, if you will. You may have heard of the greenhouse effect, but um, there, the greenhouse effect is actually a natural process as well, like extinction. Um, and there's gases in our atmosphere that, help to hold heat. And you can see this on page 12 in the book whenever we get our book. But there's these greenhouse gases that surround the Earth, and these greenhouse gases are in a part of our atmosphere that's called the troposphere. The troposphere is the layer of the atmosphere that's closest to the Earth. It extends about 11 miles up, and within that layer of the atmosphere, there are gases. And one of the poster child gases is carbon dioxide. And during most of the history of life on the Earth, these gases that are here, in addition to carbon dioxide, have been in amounts that are relatively stable over long periods of time. But since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we have started to burn things called fossil fuels. And when we're putting more and more into the atmosphere, um, more and more gases into the atmosphere than it originally, then what happens is that builds up. So the CO2 has built up in the atmosphere. And it's not just because of the burning of fossil fuels that CO2 has had a net increase, but it's also because that coupled with deforestation. Plants photosynthesize. Plants take in CO2. And if you have less plants and more CO2 going into the atmosphere, you're going to have a net gain in CO2 in the atmosphere. And what we do is we actually call plants carbon sinks. And so that means is that they take in carbon and they hold on to it for a pretty long period of time, depending on the species. Um, and they incorporate that carbon dioxide into glucose, C6H12O6. This is going back to biology and chemistry when you learn about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So there's 6 carbons here. So this, like a plant, would have to take in 6 carbon dioxides to make 6 one molecule of glucose. So it's a sink, so it's holding on to that carbon, which is good because then that brings that carbon, it takes that carbon out of the atmosphere. So since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we've burned fossil fuels, that has caused a increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, coupled with the fact that we are cutting down trees. And so deforestation then leads to less carbon sinks, which leads to a net increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there's a nice chart on page 12, a graph actually, that you guys can reference that goes over the year and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere during that year. And you'll see it's basically an exponential J-shaped curve. And what we do is we actually call um, the impact of humans on the natural world. I haven't talked about this yet, but the impact on the atmosphere, the impact on the land, we call it anthropogenic, human caused, anthropogenic. So it's an anthropogenic source of this problem. It's a human caused problem because of the activities that we've chosen to do. Okay. Number 4 is human population. Human population. Currently, our human population is about 7.2 billion people. We pretty much add just over 200,000 people a day to the earth, taking into consideration death. And so the rate of population growth has definitely increased since, humans occupied the earth, obviously. Um, but with that net increase, that exponential increase, it has definitely shown regarding the symptoms that we see on the earth regarding the health of ecosystems. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that we're starting to see the human population um, slowly decline. Not decline, but like the growth isn't as high. It's just been slowing since pretty much the 1960s. Um, but we will still see growth, but it's just not at the same rate. Um, Most population scientists, which is actually a field in environmental science, project that the human population will be around 8 billion to 9.5 billion by 2050. If we stabilize, they also believe that we'll stabilize and we'll be somewhere between where we are now, which is like 7 billion-ish, and 10 billion by 2100. So can the Earth provide the services to sustain a human population that large? Um, and one thing to also keep in mind is not only numbers, okay, so yes, numbers, that's a problem, numbers of individuals, but also your impact per person, okay? What is the impact per person? So if you look at a typical American teenager, okay, and compare them to a typical teenager from, let's say, India, which individual uses more resources? You know, what impact does each person have? How much are they using? So think about everything. It's not just what you're eating. It's what you wear. It's what you have for entertainment. So you have a computer, you have an iPad, you have an iPhone, um, you have a car, right? You have a roof over your head. You have uh, your temperature in your home is stabilized to your liking. Okay, compare all of that impact to a typical student from India who probably has an eighth of those resources. Therefore, their impact is much less than yours. And we'll be doing this ecological footprint activity online where you're going to actually measure what your ecological footprint is. Um, okay, and then the last one is resource depletion. And this is covered on pages 13 to 14. Okay, so looking at the resources, looking at countries, you know, like nations, you may have heard of the terms developed country or developing country. The United States is a developed country, so we have reached a point where economically, you know, we've got jobs, we also have clean water, we have sewer, um, all of those things, the infrastructure, they call that infrastructure, like water lines, sewer lines, storm drain lines, streets, you know, running water, buildings, you know, all of those things that kind of like indicate that it's a city, you know, that's developed. Compare that to one that is developing. So, you know, like maybe a country like Indonesia, or even parts of India that are still developing. So they're like, I guess you could say, years behind us regarding economic growth. So that's what that is, resource depletion. We'll be looking at um, all of the resources in developed and developing countries and compare use by the people in those countries. So, for example, um, developing nations, only about 13% globally drive cars and trucks. The other 87% um, are actually in developed nations. So 87% is the resource use for people in developed nations regarding the use of cars and trucks, and it's 13% in developing nations. Um, paper use globally, 84% is used by people in developed nations, and 16% in people by people in developing nations. Only 20% of the world's population lives in developed countries. But that 20% uses most of the world's resources. So that's kind of the point with me giving you those statistics. Um, so we don't like developed nation population is smaller. Okay, so it's like 20% of the 7.2 billion people, but we use um, more of the resources per person. Okay, um, and that's because, as we develop, we improve our well-being, we improve economically, and so as a result, you're using more resources for that development. Okay. What I would like you to do is this section called Do the Math in your, I want you to do this in the composition book. And it's a rate of forest clearing. We talked about how deforestation is one of the issues associated with global climate change. Um, and so I'd like you to do the math activity that's on page 14. Okay, it's do the math. And I didn't go into great detail about global climate change, and that's simply because we're going to be spending weeks on it, and we'll be talking about this, the side effects of all of that stuff too. So that was just a brief overview. Okay, and then to finalize this activity or this lecture, um, I'm just going to talk a little bit about sustainability. And so again, it's living on the earth, and yeah, this is the end. So this is the conclusion. I'll be done in a minute. Sustainability. So living on the earth so that in a way it allows us to use the resources that we have without depriving future generations. And sustainable development is really like this new area where more and more cities and countries are choosing more sustainable choices because they realize the impact they've had. Um, so it's a development that balances the our well-being, being able to continue to do what we do, and economic advancement, but you're using resource management as like the backbone of all decisions. So, for example, one sustainable thing that some cities have done is they've put in bike lanes on streets, and what that encourages is people to use their bike to go from location to location instead of using their car. Okay, something that simple. Um, let's say a city has a problem with flooding. What they could do is install um, medians, like the city of Berea has. I believe Middleburg has some. Brook Park might have some, where there's medians in the middle of the road that have soil in them and plants. And so as a result, when it rains, then um, there is less runoff from the street because it's getting soaked into the ground instead of running off the ground. And that then improves the flooding, if that makes any sense. The root systems, the plants that they plant in the medians were strategically placed, and the species was chosen because maybe they have a deep root system. And so, and they need lots of water. So then you're kind of taking all of that, you're wrapping that all together into a sustainable choice to reduce flooding. The perfect example of impact and sustainable choices is a story about Easter Island, and it's a cautionary story. And Easter Island um, is basically it's described on page like 14 and 15. There's a picture of Easter Island there, and it's the overuse of the resources by the people of Easter Island is probably the primary cause for the demise of that civilization. So it was this civilization that lived on Easter Island, and they overused their resources, and it completely collapsed. And so that's like a microcosm of what could happen on our Earth. But knowing what we know and and really implementing sustainable choices, we don't have to go there. We don't have to lead to a complete demise of our civilization because we know what we need to do. We continue to find out what we need to do to make a more sustainable living on the earth. Okay, so at this point, that is the end. I would like you to read pages 16 and 17 about ecological footprint. Again, we'll be doing an activity online about that. You do need to answer the module questions, review questions. There's only 5 on page 18, and you're going to do that in your composition book. Okay? All right, and that's the end of lecture 2.